Greetings, classicists. Welcome to the exciting World of the Hero 10-mark question essential studies video. So let's get cracking. So where do we see 10 markers in the exam? Well, I'm sure you know it, but it's worth reminding ourselves. In the World of the Hero exam, you'll have to do 3 10-markers. The first one will be a 10-mark question on the Odyssey. The second one will be a 10-mark question on the Aeneid. And the third one will be a 10-mark question in which you compare the Odyssey and the Aeneid passages. So 10-mark questions actually make up a significant proportion of your final exam. So we need to have the skills. So a little reminder again, and I'm sure you've done it all before, but the timings involved. How long do you have to do a 10-mark question? Well, with the World of the Hero, there's a little bit of a range of times and timings, if you like. It slightly depends on what sort of questions you favour, but generally you've got about 13 or 14 minutes to do a 10-marker, unless you've messed up your timings and you're frantically doing it in 6 minutes at the end. But that will not happen to you because you're all such assured and mature classicists. Anyway, you've got about 13 to 14 minutes to do a 10-marker. So just a little thought on exam strategy. When should you do them and how should you do them? Now you can of course do the exam in order. You could follow the pattern as laid out there. A 10-mark question on the Odyssey, 20-mark question on the Odyssey, 10 on Aeneid, 20 on Aeneid, 10 comparison, before finishing off with an academic flourish in your 30-mark Odyssey or Aeneid question. However, it seems that for many students there's actually a little bit of a tweak that makes the whole thing a little bit more easy in terms of order, and that is to do the 10-mark questions one after the other. So start off with the 10-mark Odyssey question, then move on to the 10-mark Aeneid question, then while both of those are fresh in your mind, do the 10-mark comparison question. So 10-marker, 10-marker, 10-marker. That seems to be quite an effective way for many students of approaching the exam. It's a slight change to the structure that the exam board have suggested with the order that they ask the questions, but it seems to be pretty reasonable. It seems to work well for some of you. So do give this a practice in mocks, or when you're just hanging around with your friends in the pub wondering what to do, sit down and do 3 10-markers in a row: Odyssey, Aeneid, and comparison question. Now, because this video is largely directed at the first years, you won't have studied the Aeneid in any depth, and you won't come on to the comparison questions till the second year. So don't panic if you've never heard of the comparison questions or indeed the Aeneid before. That's something that you'll go on and do in the second year. And because this video is kind of for both of you, I'm mentioning all these things. So let us continue to a bit of structure. Now, with the 20 and 30-mark essays, structure is really important. You need your introduction, you need your main body paragraphs, and you need your conclusion. It's also part of the formal mark scheme for your 20s and 30s. But for 10 markers, structure isn't such a big deal in terms of the formal mark scheme. It's sensible to have a structure, and some questions really demand that you do, but there's no formal mark for structure in 10-mark questions. So you don't need an introduction and shouldn't do one because that's a waste of time, and you shouldn't do a conclusion either because, again, it's a short question and you'll really just end up repeating yourself. So no introduction, no conclusion. So when it comes to structure, there's a variety of different options, and it depends on the question. You can, if you like, just fire out 7, 8 points that answer the question almost, on a separate kind of line or two. You could almost have 7 or 8 sort of mini paragraphs. I mean, that would look a little bit clumsy, and you're all such sophisticated classicists that I'm sure you'll do something a little bit better than that. But that can work. Structure is important in some of these 10-mark questions in that it aids communication. Some 10-mark questions could be for and against questions, and so you'd have a paragraph for and a paragraph against. Some 10-mark questions, if you split them up into 3 paragraphs, you might show 3 different ideas or 3 different concepts or 3 different techniques. So having paragraphs can give you or can help you show that you've included a range of techniques or ideas or themes. So it's not that structure is completely unimportant. It can aid communication, but it isn't a formal part of the process for 10 markers. So anyway, just to recap, no introduction, no conclusion, and then probably 2 to 3 paragraphs. But again, it's kind of up to you, and you need to respond to the demands of the question. So what do the exam board want in terms of the formal mark scheme? Well, here we go. We're having a look at some level 5 stuff, because none of you should be looking at anything below that, the geniuses that you are. So the 10 marker, as with the 20 and the 30, you get marks for 2 things. You've got knowledge and understanding, which is AO1, and you've got argument, which is AO2. So what are they really looking for in terms of knowledge and understanding? Well, they want you to use, as I've highlighted there, a range of well-selected, accurate and precise evidence. So when you've got a question, a 10-mark question that asks you how a passage creates an impact, you need to show that you've used the whole passage. Not necessarily a quote from every line, and it doesn't have to be precisely measured. If there's 3 paragraphs in the passage, it doesn't have to be 3 points from each, but you want to be thinking in very roughly those terms. Show that you've covered at least the important elements of the passage with a range in your answer. The other thing that will come in here is also potentially knowledge of things like cultural context and literary techniques. So it isn't simply knowledge from the passage, there is an element of knowledge beyond in terms of literary techniques, cultural context, and those are some things that we'll explore later on. So make sure in your 10-mark question you've got a nice range. What about argument? Well, it has to fully and consistently engage with the question. So again, this is nothing new, it's nothing revolutionary. Every single thing that you put in your answer, it needs to be very clear why it's answering the question. The danger with some of these 10-mark questions is that students drift into general literary analysis and they miss the connection of this literary analysis to the finer points of the wording. So if the question is, how does this passage create tension? And you explain how contrast creates drama or humour or something like that. I mean, those could be turned into a kind of tension question, but as they stand, they won't be. So make sure you're consistently and constantly engaging with the question. As I've said to my students, answer the question. Don't know why students never do. Incredibly frustrating. But anyway, see, the exam board are telling you to answer the questions. It's not just me. So let's think about the 2 slightly different approaches that we can adopt for our 10-mark questions. Now, the exam board has said you can go for the sort of machine gun of knowledge approach, if you like, with maybe 7 or even 8 short extracts from the passage with a little quote and a little bit of analysis. So boom, 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 boom. Or you can choose 3 or 4 more developed points. And again, it slightly depends on the question. Some questions will really lend themselves to 7 or 8 brief little points. Here's a quote, here's a little bit of analysis as to why it answers the question. Other passages, for example, there might not be quite so many things that you can draw from it. So you might choose 3 or 4 extracts from the text and really go into detail about why they answer the question. So both methods are appropriate. Some will be slightly more appropriate to some questions than others. And of course, you'll use your judgment as scholars to choose the correct one. So either approach is fine as a pretty general rule. Now, when we come into 10-mark questions on the Odyssey, I would argue there are broadly 2 types of question, and you need to have an understanding of both. Sometimes there will be a little bit of crossover, as we can see. So the first type of question will be one of literary techniques and analysis. So a classic would be something like, how vividly does Homer depict Odysseus' reunion with Penelope? So what you're doing is you're going through this passage and you're selecting contrast, simile, personification, any kind of literary technique, and relating it with great clarity back to the question. So it really is almost a kind of English lit style analysis. Now, other questions are still passage analysis. Everything will be a passage analysis question, but it's not really asking you to dive into literary techniques, although you might use them as they could answer the question. So a question along those lines, more of a cultural context question, could be something like, explain how Telemachus is shown to be a flawed son, or explain how Penelope is shown to be the perfect wife. Now, it's not that you couldn't go on and on about simile or personification or contrast or something along these lines. It's just that it's probably not the best way of answering this type of question. When we look at explain how Telemachus is shown to be a flawed son, we're really demonstrating the kind of the actions of Telemachus and how they match with the cultural expectations of a son at the time. So, is Telemachus brave? Well, possibly. Does Telemachus show respect for his father? Yes, certainly. Does Telemachus feed the dog? No, he doesn't. Anyway, put that to one side. So that's not so much a simile, metaphor, contrast question as a showing you understand cultural norms and explaining whether the actions of Telemachus correspond to them. So broadly two types of question: your very literary analysis ones and your kind of cultural context questions, if you like. So, as I was saying, the distinction between the two it's not always crystal clear. For example, how does Homer depict Penelope as the ideal Homeric woman? Well, part of that will be cultural context. She obeys the rules of Xenia, she's faithful to her husband, blah, blah, blah. Other parts of it could be demonstrated by making reference to literary techniques. So, for example, Homer uses a simile like Artemis or Aphrodite to emphasize her beauty and thus the kleos that she gives her husband, etc., etc. So there is a sort of fine line between the two, if you like. Anyway, what we're going to have a look at now is sort of a top 5 in terms of potential literary analysis techniques that you could use to answer a 10-mark question. Now, there are so many more, and we do more in class, but if I did all 10, 15, 20, then this video would go on and on and on forever, and I suspect it will go on for long enough as it is. So we're going to look at 5, see how they apply to some 10 markers, then you are going to have a chance to gain some literary kleos and do those 10 markers yourself. So here are the top 5 literary techniques that I've suggested that you can use for these literary analysis questions. So first of all, probably my go-to technique would be the significance of cultural context. So if a question is about how exciting is something or how terrifying is something, if someone is abusing Xenia, that adds that extra level of tension or fear or drama to a situation. So it's not an inherent literary technique like contrast, but it's understanding how the cultural context changes the nature of a passage. And Xenia, of course, being that driving backbone of everything in the Odyssey, the thing that holds society together, it's such an important idea or ideal that when it's threatened, the audience terrified. So the second idea, don't worry about writing this down too much. We're going to go through these in a fair bit more detail later on. Second idea is word choice. So just the simple choice of words, grabbed as opposed to picked up. One obviously stresses, yes, that's right, that's a real word, stresses strength, speed, blah, 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 blah. The other idea, personification, giving something human values or emotions or actions and the corresponding kind of emotional impact or ability to identify with it. Our fourth technique, Homeric simile, or indeed simple simile. Homeric similes tend to be long, complicated, almost a kind of mini story within a paragraph. And finally, our fifth go-to technique is structure, but this could be structure of sentence, it could be structure of paragraph, it could even be structure of book, although that's less relevant to a 10-mark question. Okay, so let us dive into cultural context and the impact that can have. So when you're scanning through the passage, is a key cultural ideal being abused or neglected? Because that will add a great deal of stress and tension. So when, for example, the suitors are throwing a stool at Odysseus, we know that's an abuse of Xenia, and we know that Xenia's punished. So we know, or rather we anticipate, for other reasons as well, but we anticipate great suffering and pain to befall the suitors, and extreme suffering and pain, because abusing Xenia is, well, I don't know, a sin, you might even argue, from a Homeric perspective. So throwing a stool at someone, as bad as that is that's one thing, but doing it in the context of Xenia increases drama, increases tension, and so on and so forth. And that also works for any kind of cultural concept, like the idea of kleos or time, or often the kind of appropriate role of women. And that's one of the things that makes the world of the Phaeacians so strange and complex and exciting. Nausicaa, for example, shouldn't be out by herself. So the fact that she is there just with a few maidservants is, maybe it's not necessarily abusing or neglect. Well, maybe it is neglect. I suppose it is neglecting the cultural ideal that a woman shouldn't really leave the house, and if she does, she should be heavily chaperoned. So when we see Odysseus and Nausicaa, there's this huge kind of cultural context that adds to the tension of the situation, the appropriate role and supervision of women. The same goes when a cultural ideal is being supported or promoted. If Odysseus wins a victory, it's not simply that he's then able to proceed to the next stage. He gains in kleos and heroic identity and status, and so on and so forth. So it can be, supporting or promoting a key cultural ideal can be transformative to a character. For example, when Telemachus kills his first man, poor old Amphimenus, when he's building up to it, in book 22. That's transformative for Telemachus. He gains kleos possibly for the first time ever. No, that's not true. He spoke in assembly, which is just as good. So we need to understand the kind of cultural context of the actions that our characters take and the way they're described, and that will add to the literary impact. So moving on, our next important technique. So what we need to do is word choice, think about word choice, and consider the impact of individual words. Sometimes it can just be one word that can have a really powerful impact. Like I said, grabbed as opposed to picked up. The word grab emphasizes power, strength, maybe a bit of excitement or overexcitement. Picked up, very neutral. You could pick up anything that doesn't express your emotional state. So we could consider the impact of individual words, or we could be a little bit more sophisticated and consider the impact of a group of words together. And when we look at the impact of a group of similar words together, we can call that a semantic field. So you might say, if you look at the second example on the slide, Homer uses a semantic field of brutal violence. And the words ripped, sliced, and cut, those are all violent words. They're all used together in this description. So we describe them as a semantic field, this kind of repetition of words that create a similar emotional picture, if you like. Homer uses a semantic field of brutal violence, ripped, sliced, and cut, throughout the passage to continuously emphasize the degree of damage caused by Scylla. So we've shown this selection of words, ripped, sliced, and cut. We've said that they're words all associated with brutal violence, and then we've shown that they emphasize the damage caused by Scylla. So that's a kind of semantic field. It's a bit simple. Sort of done it out of order, but like I've said before, sometimes it can just be one word. Flung creates a sense of distance and power, emphasizing Odysseus' strength in throwing the discus. So there we go. Sometimes it's just a selection of these words or these groups of words, but really dive into the meaning. Really think about the words that have been used. Slapped, punched, headbutted. All of these things. Don't know where headbutted came from. Probably just looking at my head in the camera. Anyway, there we go. So word choice, that's such a simple one that's applicable to so many different 10-mark questions. Now, our third idea, this doesn't come up as often as the other two, because I would say the other two can be used in every 10-marker, but this comes up in a lot, and this is personification. And this is when inanimate objects are given human characteristics like emotions. And this adds intensity, potential empathy, and agency. If, for example, you're being hunted by a storm that seems alive, then the storm's actions become cruel. They become deliberate. There's no escaping the storm, because if it wants to harm you, it will hunt you down in a way that in a simple, inanimate, natural event wouldn't. So personification can connect us with, it can connect our kind of emotions like rage and love to the power of a storm, but it can make things seem even more terrifying. Now, with the Homeric world, there is also this sort of slightly grey area, because in the Homeric world, they believe that almost everything is possessed with spirits, with your dryads and your naiads and your nymphs. So I think for Homer's audience, there is always that, well, personification works especially well because there is always that sense that is there some kind of minor spirit or deity or creature kind of in there or behind it. So how might we use something like personification? Homer uses personification to highlight the destructive power of the lightning strike by describing the ship as reeling. This creates the sense of a terrified creature trying to escape from a source of pain. So this ship, which is an inanimate object, is described as reeling, and we get that sense, we reel when we feel pain. When someone jabs you with a pin or something, you reel back. So you get that sensation, that extra sensation of what's happening to the poor old ship, even though it is an inanimate object. So what's our other technique, or our fourth technique? Well, Homeric simile. Simile? Why? Simile. So Homeric simile, extended comparison. So Homeric simile is a comparison usually of the exotic with the familiar. And in the Odyssey, it's so often a comparison with something agricultural, so farming, farming basically, or maritime, which is to do with the sea, so sailing or fishing. And that's because it is a farming and sailing world. So Homer's audience would have all had something to do with farming. Either they farm or they own farmland, or they sail or they live by the sea. It is a kind of sailing culture. So all of these things would have been intimately familiar with the entire audience. One would argue, except maybe women, but would women have listened? Anyway, separate debate. So what does a simile do? Well, it allows Homer's audience to gain some kind of sense of some exotic and strange stuff, some weird stuff like the Cyclops or Scylla or Charybdis, things that they would have never seen in real life, things that they would possibly struggle to imagine. So whilst they get the exotic nature of them, there's this strange combination of something exotic and unknowable just being made knowable by comparison to their world. Sometimes similes work quite well. When they seem a bit strange, if they don't seem to work so well together, that forces the audience to make to think about it. Why has the author connected this with this? So sometimes there's an element of not quite trickery to these similes, but you go, oh, hang on, why is this monster like this fish or this cow? Or why is this weird magical event like an agricultural one? So with simile, there is a lot there. When you're looking at these extended Homeric similes, there will often be multiple elements to it. So there may be a story of a man doing something, on farmland at a particular time of day. There's almost this kind of mini story in itself. So you can analyze every kind of element of the story and consider how it contrasts or supports what the thing that it's being contrasted to. Anyway, let us move on to structure. Now, structure is always a good one because we can look at sentence structure, sometimes within a sentence or just the structure of simple sentences. So short sentence structures, that's quite a tricky thing to say actually. Short sentence structures do give pace and tension. So, long sentences can get a bit flowing and confusing, maybe a bit soothing, or elaborate or complex that might reflect the situation. But when you've got these dangerous situations or you're building up to this moment of bursting of excitement, short, sharp, sweet, simple sentences can build the speed, build the tension until boom, an explosion. Another way that structure can work is the sort of contrast of a paragraph. So what starts at the beginning of the paragraph, what happens at the end, and how do we get there? How's that built up with sentence length, with the changing focus of the paragraph? I mean, structure almost fundamentally can mean anything within those lines, within those ideas. The arrangement of sentences, the positioning of sentences within the paragraph, and of course, and potentially again within the book. Although sort of book structure is probably a bit more for 20 and 30 mark questions. So those are our 5 techniques that we're looking at today. Now let's move on and have a look at how they might appear in a passage. So attached to this, there is these 2 passages, so you can read along, and don't worry, you'll have a chance to do them in a little bit. So, having a look here, we've got in yellow, the things that I've highlighted yellow, they're the sort of cultural context points I might pick out of this passage. If you haven't already, pause the video and gently read through the passage so you're entirely familiar with Odysseus in Book 12 and the storm. Did you do that? No, of course you didn't. No, I trust you. I do trust you, absolutely. So have a look at the yellow. This is our sort of cultural context point, if you like, and I think it's a reasonable example. I'd certainly use it in an exam. Sometimes there are better ones with Xenia and Cleos and so on and so forth. But anyway, so explain why this passage is a dramatic piece of writing. Well, all of these sailors are about to die, and in the Homeric world, it's unbelievably important that people are allowed to bury your body. And we see in yellow, he plunged like a diver from the deck and his brave soul left his body. So this poor sailor has fallen off the boat into the sea and will no longer be buried. And that has consequences for you in the afterlife, as we see from Elpenor back in the underworld. And then this is further reinforced when Odysseus says, there was no homecoming for them, the god saw to that. So the fact there's no homecoming, again, we get this idea they're not buried, but also, which is tragic, but also they are not able to complete their nostos. So they've lost a kind of this idea of nostos and homecoming and identity is so kind of fundamental to the Homeric world. This would be especially tragic. They never make it home again. And so the drama of these people's potential death, oh my God, this is what's at stake. They might not be buried. They might not make it home. Now, those things would, of course, be unfortunate for us, but I think we would make the point these are especially significant in a Homeric cultural context. So that would be the point that I would probably make for cultural context. So our next idea would be word choice. So have a look at the green words that I've selected, and there's so many words that you could have selected throughout this, but we've got this idea of the wind suddenly springing up. So what are the connotations of sprang? Instant, powerful, forceful, boom, quick, straight away. So the wind didn't dribble up, it sprang up. So it's a surprise, it's a shock, and the idea of springing has a bit of force attached to it. So that obviously increases the drama of the passage, because the wind doesn't just come from a slow trickle, it's boom, there. Then we go on and look at a word like smashed. So the mast struck the helmsman on the head and smashed all the bones in his skull. So think about the word smash. It hints at power, and obliteration and so on and so forth. I'm not going to tell you what all these words mean because you know better than I. But you can see how we're selecting some words that have clearly got sort of emotion or drama attached to them. Now, our third idea, which we talked about last time, 20 minutes ago, 10 minutes ago, whatever it was, is personification. Now, I've highlighted personification in blue. Now, the good thing about this, I guess, is that we're showing this idea of range in the passage. So we've got our howling winds, and then at the end, it's the sport of the furious winds. So the winds have been personified. So as howling winds, they are angry, screaming, roaring, aggressive. And then then we see all the consequences, the damage that they've caused. At the end, it becomes even worse. He's worried about being the sport of furious winds. So they're kind of callous and cruel as well as angry and powerful because they're toying with Odysseus like a cat toying with a mouse. So personifying these winds gives them just that extra level of malice and excitement. And again, with the Homeric world, it's always a bit tricky because winds do have a kind of do almost have a kind of agency, if you like, as divine spirits and so on and so forth. But I would argue the technique still very much works. So our next idea is Homeric simile, and I don't think this one really qualifies as a truly Homeric simile because it's not this long, almost paragraph length, 3 or 4 line thing where Homer goes off on a long story, but it's a simile nonetheless. So my men were flung overboard, and round the black hull they floated like seagulls on the waves. So this works in a couple of ways. We've got this idea of something that might be bringing the terrifying divine storm, wrath of Zeus, exotic adventures of Odysseus, into something a little bit more knowable by the people of Homer's audience, seagulls bobbing on the sea. That's not to say they wouldn't have seen storms. So perhaps this simile is a little bit more one of those slightly weird, challenging, contrasting ones, because seagulls kind of floating and bobbing on the sea is almost a sort of calm or serene image. So we get this strange contrast. These men have been, smashed to bits, thrown overboard to drown, if they're not already dead, and they're compared with this kind of calm, bobbing seagulls. It's a bit strange. Is that suggesting that they're dead and their corpses are just gently sort of bobbing up and down before they sink beneath the waves forever? Well, this is the beauty of literature. We can debate for hours, but this is dramatic. Okay, so our final idea is orange, and this would be structure, if you like. So the way that this sort of passage or series of passages is structured, you can see this kind of increase in tension. So first of all, we get this idea of no other land, nothing but sky and water. So it's empty, neutral, calm, in a sense. Then we get a somber cloud. So just that little sense of foreboding. The skies darken, and then boom, we're hit with a hurricane force, which then builds up to a great wave that tears the ship apart, with the keel snapping and the ship sinking. So you've got this kind of build-up, if you like, of tension throughout the passage. We've got a kind of nothing, our foreshadowing cloud, and then there we go, our hurricane force. Now, this is a great passage because there's so many things in here. There's lots of there's other similes. There's divine intervention. We could go. No, sorry, we could go on and on. But those are just some techniques. Those are how I would apply them. Now, what I've done is selected 5 techniques, which is a pretty good number because that's a good range. I've selected them from throughout the passage. So you can see, hopefully, we've got something at the beginning, we've got something at the end, we've got stuff in the middle. I would say we have covered the passage as a whole. So thinking back to our mark scheme, we've got a range of techniques and a range of analytical ideas and a range throughout the passage. Lovely. So let's move on just for a quick 5 minutes to our other question type, which is one of these sort of cultural context ones, like I was saying. Explain how Penelope is shown to be a good wife in passage B. So I don't think we're really looking at many literary techniques here. I think it is this kind of cultural context one. So let's just pick out sort of 4 or 5 ideas, and I've highlighted quite a few in yellow. And this, initially on reading through, this question seems like a bit of a tricky one, but if you take a breath and really take on board your kind of cultural context for the Odyssey, I think you'd all be able to do fantastic answers. So let's have a look at the first thing that's been highlighted. Somebody has married our much courted queen. Okay, well, this is important. It shows that Penelope is a good wife because she is desirable, and beauty is desirable in a wife. It gives the husband great status and reputation. So there we go. Simple. Because people want her, she is a good wife. Now, we then get the rest of this little extract at the top where they talk about how she's a heartless creature, she's not strong-willed enough to watch over the house, blah, blah, blah. They little knew what really happened. Now, I think there's quite a subtle point here. Penelope, as a good wife, has kind of kept away from people. She's kept away from gossip. People don't know what's going on. And I think that is appropriate for a wife as far as possible. We could also argue this shows that she's a good wife for Odysseus, at least, in that she has outwitted, was part of this great outwitting of the townspeople. So in this first section, she is beautiful, and that brings reputation, but also she's outwitted the people, and they don't know too much about her life. She's shown restraint, sort of distance where possible, and modesty. We then get a passage which is all about Odysseus being bathed and rubbed with oil by Eurynome, and it seems like a bit of a diversion. I haven't actually coloured anything in yellow there, but I suppose you could take from that passage the idea that Penelope has shown excellent Xenia because Penelope has instructed Eurynome to perform these tasks. So again, she's a good wife because she's shown an understanding of Xenia, and this is really good Xenia, bathed, rubbed with oil, clothed in a beautiful cloak, etc., etc., etc. Now, admittedly, this is her husband, and this is what should be done to him, but she's not necessarily ready to acknowledge it's her husband. So you could make the argument she is showing good Xenia to a potential stranger. You could also make the argument this is, appropriate for her husband. So either way, she wins as a good wife. Now, when Odysseus responds and says in the yellow bit there, no other wife could have steeled herself to keep so long out of the arms of a husband who just returned to her. This is emphasized, although Odysseus is frustrated with this is emphasizing an important quality of Penelope's, is that she is absolutely making sure that this is Odysseus before giving in and sort of kissing him or whatever, because the moment she gives in and does something inappropriate, even just being in a room by herself with Odysseus, not even necessarily sleeping with him or anything like that, just doing that would ruin her reputation and her life, the lineage of Telemachus, etc., etc. So although Odysseus is being a bit critical and he's a bit frustrated, I still think we should view this as a sort of an example of the quality of Penelope as a good wife. Now, into that last passage, we've got this idea of cautious Penelope. Again, I think that's a good thing. So women are expected to be cautious, especially in a situation like this, when she's trying to work out whether this man is her husband and therefore the appropriate response. She shows a slightly kind of submissive, apologetic approach to Odysseus because that's appropriate for a woman, and it is appropriate for a wife, even if she hasn't quite made up her mind. I'm not being haughty or contemptuous of you. So that kind of submissive removal of challenge, kind of explaining herself to her husband. Again, a good wife. But I have too clear a picture of you in my mind. So, as a good wife, she's got this memory of her husband from 20 years ago, and that's what a good wife should be. She should be obsessed. Well, maybe obsessed is the wrong word. I don't know. Anyway, she should have this, Odysseus, her husband, should be the primary focus of her thoughts at all times, even if he's not there, and even when she's thinking back to 20 years ago. So a careless wife or a bad wife would have forgotten what her husband looked like. But in a sense, we could be quite clever, I guess, and say that Penelope's reluctance to acknowledge that this is Odysseus is because she's such a good wife. She's got this such clear picture of Odysseus in her head because that's all she can think about, that when the new Odysseus appears, she's like, oh, well, you're not exactly as I remember you 20 years ago, and my memory is perfect because I'm such a good wife. So you can turn that to a kind of explanation of the quality of her as a good wife. When we come on to this test, the last bit that I've highlighted, move the great bed outside the bedroom that he himself built. So this is quite a good test because Penelope is showing, again, great intellect, and it's a test that only Odysseus would understand and be able to solve. So she's intelligent and she's cunning, but this cunning is appropriately directed to securing the oikos and identifying her husband. Clytemnestra's cunning is all about her personal lusts. The same with sort of Helen's cunning and intelligence to a degree, whereas Penelope's cunning is dedicated to the oikos and the husband. So, a slightly rapid run through, and I think it's quite a hard question. Hopefully, all that made sense. But what you can see that we're doing there is really just responding to this idea of kind of cultural norms and analysis. I think we could answer this question without looking at structure or simile or anything along those lines. So there we go. That was a gallop through a literary analysis question and a gallop through what we would call a cultural context question. And now that's enough of me talking, and it's over to you to complete the forms quiz attached and complete either or both 10-mark questions. And once you have done that, your Essential Studies 10-mark World of the Hero course is complete. Well done.